Thanks very much for inviting me today. Really excited to come and talk about how the healthcare sector is really embracing predictive sciences, analytics, and AI. Actually, before I start, I think the first thing I want to say is actually the science industry, healthcare industry, is very data-driven anyway. As I started to put this slide deck together, I went back and I found this slide that I presented nearly 15 years ago. This is an example of where we took 200 million documents. This was every bit of scientific data we could get hands on, every publication, every patent, every conference report, even PhD theses, and put it into a single index. And then we used that to mine. We were using NLP, but we never called it NLP at the time. So we indexed everything, and we used that to instantly find who in the world we could collaborate with, how they were connected. We used it to start to think about how could we reposition every drug we had in our company to find another shot on goal. And actually, we used it to find which companies to buy or assets to acquire. So for me, this was the first time I actually saw us using advanced analytics to actually make $100 million deals. And so for me, that was the moment I really thought, right, we have to become a data-driven company. So for me, part of the reason I'm excited to come here today and speak is to meet different companies and see where you are at your journey and how you're trying to move towards a data-driven company. We're not very good at the minute of treating data as an asset. We still see ourselves as a pharmaceutical company, a drug company. But actually, if we're going to win, it's how do we treat data in a really cool way. So AstraZeneca, one of our usual corporate slides. So if you're not familiar with AstraZeneca, I think a lot more people are familiar after COVID, but a global pharmaceutical company. We operate in 140 different countries. Typically, we've got 5 major global centers in the UK, US, and Sweden and Gothenburg, starting to build out in China, but very focused in oncology, very focused in what we call biopharmaceuticals, but sort of cardiovascular, respiratory disease, and most recently moving into rare disease. The other corporate slide out of the set of 5 that they gave me was this one. And I thought this was really telling, because actually for a large global company to have one of our core 5 slides as data and analytics says something about what the company is trying to do at its heart. And so, as we're moving forward in every walk of life that we have, we're looking at how do we make things faster? How do we accelerate what we're doing in R&D? How do we improve our performance in operations and transform what we're doing there? Actually, what do we do when we think about the patient and our sales? How do we empower the payers in the conversation? And actually underlining all of that is the data that sits below. And actually, one of the things that AstraZeneca has done is back in 2021, we launched our ethical framework for data and AI. So we're the first pharma company to do that and actually put out a statement around how we're using a framework to think about using AI at our company. So taking an even bigger step back to maybe just say how we go about drug development in our company, we start with hundreds of millions of compounds. And essentially, this becomes just a huge funnel as we go down. Thank you. We had a look at that earlier on. It's a bit broken. And so the idea is to go down from hundreds of millions all the way down to a single drug that will be really effective in man. And the best possible way we could have is actually if the first drug that we made was the first drug that we got to man. That would remove a lot of the waste, a lot of the resources and the cost. At the minute to do this, it's about 16 years to get a drug to market. It can cost billions of dollars to do that. So again, the more we can think about applying predictive science as early as possible so that that big piece becomes as short as possible, that's exponential in the reduction of cost. And we haven't stayed still in this space. The chart that you can see, this shows a sort of sliding window of the probability of success at the different phases that we have. I'm not going to test you on this chart, but essentially what it's saying is that actually between 2005, 2010, we were behind the industry. And actually 10 years later, we're ahead of the industry in every single phase. And the way that we did that was actually a core publication that was put out, which was by our head of R&D. And this was a data framework. This was a 5-point framework about how instead of going through our pipeline and having conversations where somebody would champion a drug and say, this is the best thing, and someone would say, but there's a problem with that. No, 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 this is the best thing, and keep on going. It was data-driven in how we made the decisions behind it. And that 5-point framework, which you can take a look at the publication, details to nth level how we would then look at the data behind each of those questions we put forward. As we start to think about the next 10 years, how do we think about ourselves in an AI-centric world? What does that look like? What does the data mean for each of those questions that we want to answer? So actually, when we think of AstraZeneca, like every company, we have a beautiful definition of what AI means. But in our world, it's really around replacing human learning and reasoning. Here are 3 examples. We're using supervised learning, where we're taking historical data and looking to predict the future. We do that in areas like our sales teams. So previously, we used to have 1 or 2 people in every single market that would actually look at the sales forecasting for every drug and how that would go forward. Nowadays, we run 6,000 models every month, and that's done instantly. So again, huge reduction in number of people that are doing those manual tasks, but also much more higher accuracy in predicting what's going on every single month. Another example is what we do in unsupervised learning. So an approach where we're essentially looking for anomalies from the norm. And this is an example where we are able to look at tablets going through a factory line. So if we ever find a problem on the factory line, we have to stop the line, and then actually you might have to get rid of an entire batch. This imaging approach allows us to identify those and stop immediately and deal with the situation. And the last example is a learning approach. So this is one where, again, in the factories, we're able to look at optimization approaches. And using that approach, we were actually able to add an additional line into a whole scheduling campaign. So instantly, that's about a 10% improvement on what people have been doing for a number of years who thought they knew what they were doing. Actually, we have examples across the whole of the company, but predominantly, the majority of the AI that we have is really in our R&D. This is where we're experimenting and trying new things. It's also where we've got the most variability. And so this really is where we've got the most opportunity to apply this. Today, we have over 100 use cases where AI is actually being used today in our company, in this space. And this can go all the way from the beginning, where it's target identification, and think about what do we go after for a new disease, all the way through to which patients do we select, where are they in the world, and how can we prioritize being able to test that as fast as possible. Today, the area I'm going to talk about is this area around right safety and right dose. And this is essentially where my group focus. So Clinical Pharmacology Safety Sciences is the group I'm part of. I actually head up the imaging and data analytics team. We're a group of about 80 that run imaging, data, AI, bioinformatics. And we essentially look at sort of having the right balance between these two. So right safety is really around making sure that as it goes through our models, we're predicting that it's safe to move forward. But then we're thinking about as it goes into man, we're then thinking about the safety for that. In man, we have huge variability. In our models, it's very, very consistent. And so we have this balance we have to think about. And again, this is really where predictive science is coming into its own. The majority of this talk, I'm going to talk about the icing and the exciting part of AI and analytics. But what I don't want you to forget is the cake. So we've spent a huge amount of time actually thinking about how we verify our data. So in our world, we call this FAIR. So findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. I'm intrigued to see other industries and how you're approaching this. But a lot of this is about the data that we've got. We've got huge legacy data sets and data marts and data warehouses. We're looking at new data that's coming through and thinking about how do we modernize that. Data fabric, data mesh, we're using things like Snowflake. We have things like catalogs that help us to understand where we're putting our data. Essentially, we focus on our data backbone. So if we do want to apply any of this AI, we can always find that data and have good lineage to know where it's come from. I might mention this later on, but if your users use a system and then don't trust the data, they will not come back to the system again. So for us, that's been absolutely key. Every single thing that we've done, you'll hear me talk a little bit about knowledge graph. We've published in Nature around some of the work we've done on knowledge graph. But again, instead of us just being really fast and getting something out, we've really spent our time to build something really, really hardcore in terms of quality. And then from there, we know we can just keep building upon it. So the rest of the talk, I'm actually going to talk about just 3 key examples. I'm going to talk about how we're looking to redefine what we do with the right safety. I'm going to talk about how we speed up and maybe give access to our pathology experts additional information they've never seen before. And then the third one is actually how AI is enabling us to try new analytics that we've not been able to do before, and new science. So the first example is an example where traditionally we have these physical assays that we need to run. These are assays that might involve cell lines, they might be animal model assays that we have to run. These can take up to 2 years to run. It's a huge amount of effort and resource. Ethically, there are questions about what we should be doing in that space as well. And typically they're focusing on certain things. It's thinking about the heart, it's thinking about the liver, we have things in the gut, things in kidney. So we know the sort of regions that we want to graft and we can target those. But this is compulsory, this is something that we have to do, we have to go through this approach, and we can't really get around that. What we can do, however, is we can then start to think about how we apply predictive science in this space. So in this area, this is an area in fact, when I first joined the company 24 years ago, this is the first thing I started to work on. And actually, we've built these predictive models up. And in the last 5 years, we've moved all of them into more of a machine learning approach. So that's helpful because you can think about maybe replacing a single assay. But actually, what's really exciting now is that we run those assays all at the same time as a predictive science approach. The team run 4 million molecules every single day. That means that we can actually screen. We can go back to that funnel really early on and then start to predict which of those molecules are going to be safe as we move forward. Which of them do we predict are going to make it through those assays? So again, as we hit those physical assays, we're not seeing the challenges we've seen before. That sounds very nice, but actually if I look at the last 10 years at AstraZeneca, not a single compound has failed for safety in our clinical trials. If I compare that to the previous 10 years, it was about 80. Every single drug going through a clinical trial is about $10 to $100 million. So it's a huge potential waste if we don't get this right. The other thing that then becomes very exciting is actually we can build ensemble models. We can take a number of those models and actually combine them and bring them together. And that actually allows us to have more of a confidence interval and really start to understand what's going on. Have I lost my mic? Oh, no. It's not really about a black and white yes or no to something. It's actually about more of being able to have confidence and trust so people have a selection and a choice as we go through. So that can be very helpful, but often it means that we're using animal models, using animal cell lines to predict toxicity, which in itself is a problem because we end up in a world where we're predicting if our compounds are going to be toxic in an animal, which isn't what we want. We really want to predict if it's going to be toxic in man. And so that then thinks about the translatability between those cell lines or animal models all the way through to man. And there are differences, species differences, cross-reactivity, etc. So instead, what we've started to do is look at events that take place in man. So we've examined patient samples where we see these kind of liver signals. We've used gene expression. We've identified a number of transcription factors hidden away. There's about 20 that we've identified. And they appear to be a signal for when people are having this liver injury. And we've taken those and then we've applied it back and tested it within our animal models and our cell lines. And we've spotted that we're seeing these come up. And so actually we're now able to use that as a very early screen. So much so that recently we had something coming through and we saw a potential positive, and people were sort of thinking, hang on, we're not seeing this, but again, we're giving evidence in a predictive way, and we're starting to validate that information, that actually our models are more predictive than the animal models and onion screening. So again, there's real potential behind this approach. Again, we can run this with thousands of compounds earlier on, which we could never do before. Second example I wanted to give is more of an imaging example. So this is an example where we have pathologists that, again, for the last 20, 30 years have looked down a microscope, they're looking at the sections and trying to identify what they can see. Is it normal? Is there something that's untoward? Is there something idiosyncratic that's going on? Nowadays, a bit like we expect at home, we expect more, right? They expect more, right? When they look down that slide, what are they expecting to see? In fact, they don't want to look at 100 or 1,000 slides. They want to look at the 10 slides that are slightly different and have something interesting. The 990 slides that actually are boring and don't really show anything, that's a waste of their time. So how do we automate and remove those? How do we run QC so that there's no slide that they look at where it's out of focus or it's badly stained? Actually, how do we apply AI? So I should say we are applying AI to remove those and send it back to get recut or restained. But even when they see something, they spot something and say, oh, there's something going on here. Have we seen it before? If we did see it before, what did it mean? Was it a serious consequence? Was it something we could mitigate? Does the literature back this up? 40, 50 million publications. Is there something we can tap into to start to say straight away, actually, this is what I'm looking at, this is what it means? How do we bring all of that together in a world where typically these individuals are not data savvy? So let's create some complicated pathology 4.0 cockpit with all of that information at their fingertips. This is a bit frightening, and I don't think I might share this with my pathologists, but they want to ask really complicated questions. Right? So even if we did come up with something, it just would be very difficult for them to be able to use, because every day is a different question. And actually, this is why what we started to do is look at the data that underpins all of this. So actually we have mocked something up and put it in front of our users and seen what they sort of start to say. We then realized actually it's the different data sets and how we bring that together, and that's where we start to look at graph. So for us in this situation, graph's really helpful. It's very flexible. It allows us to plug in different complicated types of data, and it's all about relationships. So if they see something, we think something like this is interesting, you might want to take a look at. And graph is not new in AstraZeneca. I've been building knowledge graphs for about 12 years. I've built two of the biggest ones inside AstraZeneca. We've got a knowledge graph, which is called Biologic Insights Knowledge Graph. I mentioned before all of the publications and patents and conference reports and all of our internal experimental data. That now sits in things like Biological Insights Knowledge Graph. It's been published in Nature. There's things like our Competitive Intelligence Knowledge Graph. So people like Pascal, our CEO, they leverage reports that come out of that. So again, how do we understand what our competitors are doing and see where we can move next? I'm going to talk a little bit about our knowledge graph that we've done for animal study data. So very complicated data, which is normally hidden away and nobody really ever has access to this. And to try and search and interrogate it takes weeks. But actually, when we do think about knowledge graph in an enterprise setting, typically it's been built for techies, right? The teams that we've had and we've built some amazing things, and some examples on the left-hand side here, where they've started to think, well, even as a technical person building these knowledge graphs, let's make it accessible. We'll have toolkits and we'll have example data sets, and data scientists come and grab it. But we're all very familiar with Siri, and we're very familiar with Alexa, and you've never had to write a Sparkle query to ask what's the weather going to be like in Frankfurt in 2 days' time. So how do we think about it from the end user point of view? How do we think about it from that pathologist point of view? because they don't want to write a Sparkle query. They'll never be in that world. So here is a prototype, a POC that we built. This has taken all of our animal study data for the last 20 years. We've put it through Snowflake and put it into Neo4j, and then we put a bit of ChatGPT over the top. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then actually, for the end user point of view, they can come in and they can just ask any question they want. And so as they start to ask any question over that data, the results come back. Now, a single query here might take 7-8 hours normally with one of my experts to go and get this for them. They're able to do this themselves, and whilst we've pasted in the query, the actual response is the timed response that it takes to generate this. The thing I want to say here is that the challenge that we have is that we can't apply OpenAI ChatGPT to allow it to have hallucinations. Right? Take a machine learning model. A machine learning model is fantastic, 95% accurate. 1 in 20 times it's going to be wrong. When we deal with safety information, we can't be wrong. So how do we go around that? So what I've kind of described is I want to think about how we have frictionless access. How do we make it intuitive for our end users? And so behind the scenes, under the hood, is this sort of layer of complexity. So AWS, we've got 4 databases that are running. We pull that information in. We push it into our knowledge graph where we have our edges and nodes connected. And essentially, there are 2 OpenAI queries. The first is somebody writes their natural language question, and then actually we turn that into a cipher query. So again, we're not actually going against a bunch of documents and asking it to generate hallucinations. We have a number of prompts that we've already set up, which were pretty accurate. They're able, when they're asking their question, it recognizes the right sort of prompt. And therefore, we end up running the cipher query. That goes against the graph. We get the data back as a JSON file. The user doesn't want to see a JSON file, so we take the JSON file and turn that back into natural language. So again, we've really thought about the end user process here, rather than just thinking, hey, let's try ChatGPT and get something out. Users love it. There's no crazy queries. And people that have been at our company for 20 plus years, they've never had anything like this at their fingertips before. Third and last example I was going to give is an example around how we're exploring new technologies. Ironically, starting with something that's quite old. So we've been doing things like high content imaging for 25 years. This is an example where we might take 2 or 3 stains, have hundreds of thousands or millions of images coming through. We stain them up and try to see where there's a change. And that change we're interested in to see what it might do in the future. Nowadays, what we're able to do is we can use multiple stains. And for every single cell in every single well, we're then able to capture thousands of features. So all of that data is a huge avalanche that we have to handle. And we've never been able to handle that level of data in the time frame that we need it to be. Now, with cloud and the maths behind this now, we can now do this to a level that we could never do before. And again, the human brain just couldn't interpret everything that's going on. So again, we're needing this kind of level of power to be able to handle it. And that's the first part, because this is really the challenge that we've got. My imaging team, I run an imaging group which is about 30 scientists, some wet lab, some dry lab. We have probably about 12, 13 different types of imaging modalities that we run. 2 of them I'm just sharing on the right-hand side, but we'll have imaging modalities that go from preclinical and animal all the way through to clinical. So we're starting to look at things like whole body imaging with human patients. The top right example is an example of multiplex. So I showed an example before where we might be looking at 2 or 3 stains. This is 40 stains in the single image, and we might have that running through time. So when you start to think about looking at 40 different composites, again, human brain is very difficult to kind of interpret this information, and this is really where AI steps into its own. And the example below, just because it's so big, this is a 5 terabyte image of a mouse lung. And so now, we're able to get such high precision, we're able to detect the distribution of where our drugs are going to a level we've never been able to capture. I talked before about gene expression. I've talked about imaging. This all now starts to come together. Sorry. And what we're able to do is actually combine the two. So we have the option of being able to go in and start to really identify where something is happening. This might be in a patient, it might be in an animal. But actually, once we understand exactly where something is happening, we can hone in and then start to apply a number of different approaches. So in this case, we apply things like spatial transcriptomics, we look at proteomics, we look at metabolomics. Start to understand not just the gene expression, but the protein levels that are flowing through. And actually, we apply things like vectors and embeddings, so we can combine all of this data together. In the past, these 4 different types of data types would be very different data types, and you sort of do your analytics on one and say, oh, I think this is going up, and I do my analytics on another, and this is going up. Nowadays, we combine it all and start to look at the patterns that we're seeing across our data sets, across all 4 data modalities. So hopefully today, I've given you a bit of a different perspective on pharma and what we're doing, and how we're applying AI and analytics in what I think is quite an exciting way. So I'd leave with 3 strategic insights. So the first is that data foundation. You have to invest in the data. I was at BioIT a couple of weeks ago, and there were so many presentations that came up and talked about generative AI, and they hadn't invested in their data. They were just, let's go and do something. And actually, they were building so many things on sand. And as soon as you put that out, and as soon as the user uses it, they're going to be in a position where they just don't trust the data, and it's going to take you so much time to get back the credibility. It's really, really, really tough. The second is scaling. So take your time. Everyone's running a million miles an hour to try and do everything. But just stop and listen and listen and listen to your customer. Often the biggest challenge we have is the people that are building lots of these things are really techie and geeky, and they want to talk about the technical geeky thing that they've managed to achieve. And it's the end user and what they're trying to achieve and the frictionless access that we miss. And so the more you can get those 2 sides talking, the closer you are to getting a hit. And then the last thing is there's so many things you can do. Try to be clear and limit yourself. So actually as a group, I used to run a tech innovation team for our CTO for 5 years. I joined this R&D group a couple of years ago, and they had 60, 70 collaborations all over the place and no direction. So again, how do you have direction so every single thing you're doing is taking you towards an endpoint that you're looking for? So with that, thank you very much. I didn't get a warning, so I think I might have some time for some questions.
Something I haven't mentioned in the introduction is what we do here is we have presentations 5 in a row with breaks in between. And then after those 5, we'll have the discussion rounds. And that will be the moment for you to ask and answer any questions. But sure, take one for now. Yeah. But then for that moment, that will be the moment for them to continue that conversation. And so every speaker will be assigned a table, 1 through 5, and you'll see on the screen here which one you'll be able to join the speaker at, and then continue that conversation. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. If you want to do one question, go for it. Yeah.
Thanks. I gave the honor because I was quicker. Hi. So thank you for this nice presentation. So you discussed about knowledge graphs and how you combine your large language models and prevent hallucinations. So I wondered, where is then the bottleneck, like when you want to extend the system? Is the bottleneck then the knowledge graph where you need to manually probably enter information, or would that be correct?
Yeah, so actually we are taking a number of different approaches to this. So you saw this slide. So part of the good thing of building a number of these things and being in that space for a long time, I used to run, I've done lots of things at AZ, but I used to run the Enterprise AI Services Group at AstraZeneca. So we built a team of about 100, 150 for Enterprise AI. And part of that was about the platforms. And so one of the things we recognized, a bit like we sort of mentioned data mesh, with our data, we're trying to federate the data and give that responsibility to people in the organization to own their own data accountability. A lot of time people want to throw it over the fence. We're trying to do the same with knowledge graph. So can you be in a situation where we can federate our knowledge graphs and connect them together, but you don't really want one big knowledge graph? So having the ability of being able to say, well, here's all of our biological data, here's all of our competitive data, here's our safety data, we can now connect those to do something. So that's part of what we're looking at doing. And actually, the BIKG group, as an example, they've just released something called Research Assistant. So Research Assistant is actually a large language model over the top of their graph. So as opposed to what I showed, which is building an OpenAI approach, which is just to create the graph query, what they've actually done is they've done a large language model over the content of the graph, which is more what I think you were getting towards. So by having a very, very high quality knowledge graph, which we then believe are good facts that we believe, we then can put the large language model over the top of that, and they've compared that to external graphs and external large language models, and the results they're getting are really, really, really quite accurate. So once we've got confidence there, we know we can start to add or federate to other graphs. Happy to talk later on about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.